Yay. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Garvey, and I'm an AmeriCorps member here at Travelers Rest State Park. Today, we're going to travel a little west of Travelers Rest to an area some of you may know as Lolo Pass. Today, we have Bruce Mihelish, a volunteer interpretive guide at the park, and he'll be diving into his interpretation of the 1805 Ascent to Glade Creek from Travelers Rest. This is Bruce's second diorama, depicting what life was like for the Corps Discovery in the Lolo area. I encourage you all to take a look at the dioramas next time you're in the visitor center. They are pretty cool. And I'll let Bruce take it away now. And it's all yours.
Thank you, Jess. And I think we're making this pretty much as a training video for our volunteers. So my first thing I want to do is take this opportunity to thank all the volunteers that come out to the park and make this a real special place for our visitors that come see us. We've probably got some trainees every year, so hopefully they can use this as a learning tool and kind of help us review and stay all on the same page. So we're telling our story as accurately as possible. I'd like to thank Montana State Parks. I'd like to thank Travelers Rest Connection for all their support out at the park. Like they say, it takes a village. We have a special group of people that have been coming over to the park for about the last 10 years, and they come in 6-month and 12-month stints. And these are our AmeriCorps volunteers, like Jess over there. And I just have to say this, that honestly, these young, energetic people bring so much to the park. They just give us a shot of energy that makes it fun and makes our volunteers better. So the contributions are endless. But I just need to thank them in a special way. So we're going to talk today about the Ascent to Glade Creek, which is Lewis and Clark's 1805 trip out of Travelers Rest up to Lolo Pass. And we did it in a diorama fashion to symbolize what we may think happened on that trip. A lot of this comes from the journal, so most of it is factual. Some of it is fill in the blank, but we think we have it fairly accurate. Now, I must admit, I was unable to volunteer out at the park during this pandemic, so this helped my desire to volunteer and give back to the park, and probably kept me sane as well. These dioramas are about 80–90% research and about 10% manual work. So I'm going to try to paint a picture for you as what you're looking at when you take a look at this Ascent to Glade Creek diorama, number 2, that sits in the Museum of the Visitor Center now. You can see this long string of pack animals, and they are actually crossing what today we call Packer Meadows. It's on September 13th, 1805. Oh, the weather's fair to partly cloudy. Some of the men in the journals called it pleasant. And you can see they're traveling around Glade Creek is what they call it. We call it today Pack Creek in Packer Meadows. They're almost upon their campsite. They're looking for a good grassy spot for their horses. There's 4 hunters coming into the scene on the edges of this diorama, all of them empty-handed. There's no game, so there'll be no dinner tonight. There's quite a string in the meadow out here. There's roughly 33 pack animals, 8 mounted horses, and 4 colts. There's 35 people here, 33 of the Corps, including Sacagawea, her baby, and Charbonneau, and old Toby and his son, the Shoshone guides that they found down at the Shoshone camps. Lewis is sitting on a rock over there with his dog Seaman waiting for his horse. He lost the horse late the night before. Old Toby's son also lost his horse. So they're bringing up the rear, waiting for one of the hunters to bring up their horses. The hunters were out all day looking for these lost horses. There's roughly 5 people out in front, including Old Toby, Drilliard, York, Clark, Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and they are looking for a good place to camp, and they're out in the lead. And then in between, there's the corpsmen that are leading the ponies across this big open space that's literally right behind today's Lolo Visitor Center. You can actually walk to this spot. This area is about roughly 3 football fields long to give you an idea. It's all to scale. It's called in scale. It is 13 feet to the inch. So you interpret that as, a 6-foot person is less than a half an inch tall in this diorama. So it is to scale. Most of the men are carrying a 1-pack horse, leading 1-pack horse on foot. However, a couple of them have 2-pack horses, and then a couple of them have a pack horse and with a mare with a colt. So it's varied how they're hauling these. They just came up a fairly steep and down timbered climb. So they're right at the top. This is a nice flat spot and probably gives them a little bit of a time to gather themselves before they set up camp. These folks are tired and they're hungry. They've only eaten 1 deer in the last 24 hours. You think of roughly 25 pounds of meat for 35 hungry, hardworking souls. It's not enough. So starvation and hunger are definitely in the mix. So why is this relevant to Traveler's Rest, you ask? Well, it's simple. It's all about the horses. And that's what we're trying to capture here is to convey to people that it was all about horse transport from Traveler's Rest over the Lolo Trail and the Nez Perce villages. They had 45 horses at Traveler's Rest in 1805 with 35 people. So there was more horses than people. In 1806, when they returned, they had over 70 horses. So, these are large herds of animals that need to be fed and watered and cared for, and not quite as simple as maybe hauling canoes up the river. So Traveler's Rest was a virtual stockyards in 1805 and 1806 when they were here. And to put it another way, I think it's important for us to appreciate the horse for all their contributions to mankind. You think of all the great civilizations that cropped up over time, all of them did it on the backs of horses, whether it be Greece or Rome or Persia, the Moors of North Africa. I could go on, but all those civilizations depended on the horse, as did Lewis and Clark. You think about no horses, no Pacific Ocean. They can't go back and report to Jefferson that the mission was accomplished, that they did find a way to the ocean and called it the Northwest Passage. So anyway, that's the purpose of this, is to demonstrate the use of the horse by the expedition. And if you take a look around the park, I think we do a wonderful job interpreting our famous campsite, latrines and cook fires. We have a terrific display of replicas of Lewis and Clark. We have some great nature displays. Our recent new ones are of a grizzly bear and the beaver. And we do a fairly good job of interpreting Native American cultures and honoring people of this area, the Salish. But there's no honoring the horse. I read something that's kind of interesting talking about sacrifice to mankind. There was over 1 million horses killed in World War One. That just blows me away that's how many horses were lost in that war. Of course, then armies became mechanized and the horses were cast aside. But they have been sacrificing for mankind for a long time. So there's my plug for the equine species. This diorama also depicts this gargantuan effort of hauling 4,000 to 5,000 pounds of cargo by pack. That's about 150 pounds per animal. So again, that's what this scene was all about. So why the need for horses? I mean, they've been on the water as a naval expedition for about 3,000 miles ever since they were in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, down the Ohio, up the Missouri, then up the Jefferson to where they met the mountains. And then suddenly it's like, boy, we need horses and we need them fast. So Patrick Gass says it best in the Journals of September 1805. Patrick Gass describes these mountains as dismal, horrible, and terrible. The most dismal, horrible, terrible mountains he'd ever beheld. And they are intimidating. And they traveled against this wall to their west for 150 to 200 miles before they found this gap right at Travelers Rest. So think about this. About the time they get to Travelers Rest, they've abandoned their naval capacity. They've actually hidden their canoes and sent the keel boat back to St. Louis. And now in the mountains here in Montana, they become a cavalry. And you think of these French boatmen they brought along to navigate the rivers, and a lot of these military infantrymen that probably never handled horses. This was an instant transition from water to land. And I'm sure it was challenging at times, taking in consideration that these ponies that they acquired were probably half wild Indian ponies that weren't well broke. So where would these ponies come from? Well, Lewis and Clark did have some intelligence from the Hidatsus and the Mandan people the winter before that the Shoshone out west would probably have horses. And in fact, that's probably the reason they were attracted to hiring Charbonneau and Sacagawea as interpreters. Sacagawea has a baby, but they bring the baby along too. And something tells me they thought the mountains were a little bit closer and the Shoshone people were a little bit closer, but it took them 4.5 months of river travel to finally find the Shoshone. And that's about the same time they ran into this impenetrable wall of mountain. So fortunately, the Shoshone were there, and Kamehameha was the chief of the Shoshone, and he was fairly helpful. He wanted some arms in return. Lewis promised those arms at a later date. And the one thing that might have helped the diplomacy and trade more than anything is Sacagawea's brother is Kamehameha. She'd been kidnapped by the Hidatsus years ago, and she returns to her own tribe, her own people, and her brother is calling the shots. So that had to help. Kamehameha also contributed a guide that would take Lewis and Clark north to find this gap in the mountains here at Travelers Rest and be able to cross over the Lolo Trail. So he made lots of contributions, gave lots of help. Sacagawea actually got her own horse, bought that privately. Charbonneau helped buy it for her by trading for it. And so when they marched out of the Shoshone camps in today's Lemhi Valley of Idaho, they left with approximately 30 horses, which was almost enough. They got all their gear loaded, but they really were taxing their horses and probably needed a few more along the way. Then they go up this terrible, awful, steep pass that the Indians don't even use. We call it Lost Trail Pass today. Lewis was told by old Toby, the guide, to go another way, but he refused. He was in a hurry to get into this Bitterroot Valley, so they go over this horrible pass. They actually wear out, trash. 7 horses become lame and become worthless. So they stagger off these mountains into the southernmost reach of the Bitterroot Valley, and they run into these people called the Salish. Now, Clark and Lewis both call them different names, the Flatheads, the Tushapaws, the Ootlashoots, but these people are the Salish people, and that's the way they prefer to be called today. But with that, the Salish took pity on these poor men that staggered out of the mountains and were, for the first time, beginning to be starved and cold and hungry. They gave them buffalo robes to warm them. And over a period of a couple of days, Lewis and Clark were either traded for or gifted another 20 ponies. They had to abandon the 7 that they ruined, but so they walked out of the Salish camp with roughly 43, 44 horses. And they were well suited now for all the equipment they had to carry. There's a third tribe that stepped in to help too, and now these folks are on the other side of the mountains. They're into Idaho on the other side of Lolo Pass, the Nez Perce. Lewis and Clark called them the Chapunish, and they really came to the rescue. They fed them, nursed them back to health with salmon and roots, and they showed them how to build canoes by burning out and hollowing out the middle. Twisted Hair, the chief, offered to keep and care for the 38 ponies that were left on the other side of the mountains so they could paddle to the Pacific in canoes. They stored their tack equipment in caches. And these people were, of all the people that Lewis and Clark ran into, I think Lewis at least was most like them, most trusted them. They gave them mapping instructions on how to cross the mountains back to the east to the Missouri River. They were excellent equestrian people. They knew how to care for their horses better than anybody they'd ever seen. There were medical techniques they used on their horses that really worked better than the white man techniques. So Lewis and Clark truly learned a lot from these Nez Perce or Chapunish. Let's just digress a minute and talk about this animal called the horse, the Equus ferus caballus. Where did they come from and how did they get to North America? Well, it's interesting, but they started out in North America as a small, tiny little dog-like animal, and it was as tall as maybe a small dog 50 million years ago. And it foraged on trees and shrubs. And over the years, it got out on the grasses of the Great Plains of North America, and it grew. And it also dropped its toes. It started out with like 4 toes and ended up with 1. that one toe today we call a hoof. And obviously the horse grew in size based on the illustrations you see here. Sometime about the end of the last ice age, about 10 to 12 million years, 12,000 years ago, my mistake, 12,000 years ago, the man was pouring into North America and hunting the horse basically to near extinction. So I think the horses wised up and actually went the opposite way into Eastern Asia and migrated into Southern Asia, North Africa, the Middle East, Eastern and Western Europe. The camel followed them. So camels and horses went east, and then the llamas that also evolved on the North American plains headed south for their survival and protection. So these three species made it out, and they weren't taken out by hunting. Some species were. Think of the saber-toothed tiger or the mastodons. Lots of species were hunted out by man in North America. So, 10,000 years ago, the horse was off this continent. They were gone. The Native American, the Indian people were here, but they didn't have access to horses. The horse then took this incredible trip around the world. And I think this is one of the most amazing things that I've learned in my research on the horse. About 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, the horse had migrated into the central steppes of today's Russia, above the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And people figured out that it was better to domesticate a horse and use them as their beast of burden than it would be to eat them for dinner every night. So this was a wonderfully centralized location where these domestic beasts could be imported over down into India and China, down to the Middle East, and then across to Europe and North Africa. So over a period of about 5,000 years, the horse spread out all over the Eastern Hemisphere, including North Africa. In about 700 AD, the Moors of North Africa invaded Spain and actually took control of Spain, and they used their war horses to do that. They're called the Spanish barb horses. They also brought a breed called the Arabian horses that we still have around today. And then this amazing thing happened. About 1400, 1450 AD, the Spanish kicked the Moors out of Africa, but they keep their horses. And on Columbus's second expedition across the Atlantic Ocean, he stops in Cuba and Haiti with a load of horses and drops them off, and these horse plantations start beginning to crop up in the Western Hemisphere. Eventually they get to Mexico. Cortez takes horses over to conquer the Aztecs, and all of a sudden these horses are multiplying and thriving on the southwest plains of today's United States, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. There's large herds of horses thriving. It's kind of interesting how the Spanish brought those horses over to reintroduce them to the North American continent. They actually put them in slings in the holds of ship for like 6 to 8 weeks until they arrived. Then they would winch them up over the top of the deck and dump them off into the ocean and hope they could swim to shore. Now that's a tough, durable horse, and it was well suited for what it was looking forward to next. So by the 1600s, about 100 years after Columbus, the early 1600s, these horse ranches had been developed in the southern United States into Texas and New Mexico. And somewhere along the line, the Indians of North America, the North American plains, figured out that this wasn't a food animal, food source. It was really a beast of burden. So, by the 1680s, the Southern, like the Utes and the Apache, the Comanche, were gaining control of these Spanish horses, mostly by stealing them. And they quickly made up through three basic trade routes, one through California, one through the Rocky Mountains, and one along the Missouri River. So by the time, 150 years later, all the North American tribes had access to horses. And it changed their lives forever. Remember, they've been running around, not getting very far out of their own home territories with dogs. And all of a sudden, this horse comes along and makes them more mobile. They can go longer and further. And so it starts creating conflict between the tribes and their homeland territories. It also brings white man diseases like smallpox when the horses come up through the Western Plains and Rocky Mountains. So not everything about the horse was good for these native peoples. The horses that Lewis and Clark used specifically were the Spanish bark Mustangs. They're short, strong, and durable. They're a perfect fit for the mountains of the Great Plains. They have extra strong hoofs. They don't need to be shod. They have short backs. They're strong. They're just made perfectly. Most horses today are about 15 hands high. That's a measurement from the ground up to their front shoulder blade. And these Spanish barb horses were roughly 8 inches shorter at that point, about 13 hands, maybe 13 to 14 hands. So they were much shorter. They also had one distinguishable trait. They have one less lumbar vertebrae than all other horse breeds. They only have 5. All other horse breeds have 6, other than the Arabian that has 5.5. It's interesting that the Arabian and the Spanish barb both evolved on the North African continent, and so they're just a little different. You can still find Spanish barb remains on the wild horse ranges, like in Wyoming or Nevada, and the distinguishing characteristic is that if you look at the backbone, the skeleton, there's only 5 lumbar vertebrae. Kind of interesting. So here we are, we're back to our story. These are actually William Clark's maps that he drew probably out at Fort Clatsop in the winter of 1806. And the one we're looking at, the map we're looking on the left is, that's Bitterroot Valley. So here's the Sula area to kind of help you get your orientation. Darby would be right about here, Sula about here, and then you come up the road a little bit and here's Hamilton, and then you get up here into this area, there's Stevensville, and then Lolo would be right here on this corner where this is Lolo Creek today. Lewis calls it Travelers Rest Creek, and this is the Bitterroot River. Clark calls it Clark's River. I think Lewis convinced him that that would be a good name for this river, since Lewis named today's Salmon River after himself, the Lewis River. So I think it was Clark's turn. And you can see these little dots along the rivers. This is the path of Lewis and Clark. And Clark was that detailed to put the dots in. You can see where they crossed the Bitterroot River right here and came into Travelers Rest. And this is clearly marked on the south side of the creek is encamped this 9th and 10th of September, 1805, and then again in July 1806. You can see the next camp up the road by Woodman Creek, and you can see this little path up the Lolo Trail all the way to the top. It's amazing how accurate Clark's maps are. This picture that was drawn about 50 years later by a gentleman named Gustav Soholm, who was with the Mullen expedition. You can see there's very few trees on these mountains. There's trees along, this is Lolo Creek, Travelers Rest Creek then, and this is Mormon Creek, still is Mormon Creek, but very few trees compared to today. It's just kind of an interesting look at what Travelers Rest might have looked like at the time of Lewis and Clark. Okay, so the map on the left, again, is that same map as you saw on the other slide, but it's been enlarged, and you can see this little foot travel here. This again is Lolo Creek, or Travelers Rest Creek. You can see here's Travelers Rest Camp, then this is Woodman Camp, and then there's a 8 o'clock camp up here. That's because they got in so late at 8 o'clock. And it's just a little here east of Little Hot Springs. Up on top here is where this diorama is, and you can see it marked as glades. You can see a distinct divide. Here's Pack Creek or Glade Creek, and it's kind of traveling east to west and then takes a sharp turn to the south. And they're right here in the diorama. They camp down below about a half a mile along Glade Creek, heading south. This creek here is called Lee Creek, and it's a tributary of Lolo Creek. And this is the path they took. This is the ridge they took up to Packer Meadows. This is a picture of the area that they crossed on September 13th, 1805, and you can see how rough and rugged it is. In the background, those are the Bass Cliffs, and right about here is where Travelers Rest would have been on the other side of this mountain. And they came up these ridges, and you can see why the Indians would travel these ridges instead of going down one ridge and up another. It was almost impossible rough travel. So the trails would be along these ridges on top. So they could basically stop all the up and down travel that you can see this clearly would create. Up on top of Lolo Pass is this wondrous place, one of my favorite places in the world. And it's called Packer Meadows today. Clark named it Quamish Meadow. Notice how he spells meadow, but you get it, right? So anyway, in June, early June, this flat that's depicted in this diorama turns to this beautiful purple plain, and that's camas, and that is a major food staple for the Nez Perce, the Salish, and even the Shoshone. It has a root that they would eat and boil, and it was kind of their starchy carbohydrate supplement. I took this fall picture on about the same time Lewis and Clark came through here on September 13th. I think I took this picture on September 18th, but you can see the beautiful colors that this thing explodes into in mid to late September. Lee Creek is you can still go up these roads along Lee Creek and basically follow the trail of Lewis and Clark. You don't have to go up Highway 12. And I mean, if there's a way to experience following in the footsteps and actually seeing pretty much the same untouched environment that Lewis and Clark did, this is the place to go. And it's only like 45 minutes from Travelers Rest State Park. You know, it's a must see, even if you just go to the visitor center and drive behind it a mile or so, you'll get a feel for this unbelievably beautiful and untouched zone, just real close to us. Okay, so here's a shot of the diorama looking both ways. The shot on the left is the one you saw earlier. There's a gentleman down here in a blue coat. That would be Meriwether Lewis. His dog Seaman is there by his side. And here's a hunter bringing over a mount for him that somehow he had lost on the trip the day before. You can see this long pack string, and again, Clark and Old Toby and Drewley are up front looking for a place to camp. This is just another look at it from the other direction. And you can see my friend Dale at the park put together this map to show you exactly where this diorama shows. You can see Highway 12 here in the Lolo Pass Visitor Center. And there's just a little road that curves out behind the Visitor Center. You can take a right at the fork and go down to the Glade Creek camp and actually observe where the campsite would have been. It's that big grassy area down there. Remember, we got about 45 horses to feed. And then over here is where you're looking at the diorama. It's a big open flat spot, just coming out of Packer Meadows and heading down to Glade Camp. Note that we're trying to stay accurate with the fall colors, and that's kind of how it looks like up there today. To finish my story on the trip, they go down to the river from Glade Creek, the Locksaw River. They kill a colt. They have absolutely found no game, so they make the decision to kill their first colt. Then they climb up this horrendous ridge we call Windover Ridge today. They get up on top of the ridges up there, and they travel basically due west along the ridge tops. Along the way, they have to kill 4 more ponies for food. There's no game up there. And they end up down on Wee Prairie, and that's where they meet the Nez Perce. And again, this is the 3rd tribe that come to their aid and help save them from not only starvation, but point them in the right direction. This crossing of the Lolo Trail in 1805 was a horrendous, cold, wet, tiring process. It probably tested the core here more than any other place on the Lewis and Clark Trail. So they complete this 11 brutal days and they identify a new Northwest Passage. This is the Nez Perce Trail, and you can see a map. There's actually 2 Nez Perce trails. There's a southern route out of Elk City, Idaho, and it comes out just a little bit north of Ross's Hole at Connor, Montana, where the West Fork meets the East Fork of the Bitterroot. But they took this northern trail from this Lulu Fork in the Hot Springs over, and this is where the Nez Perce came to their rescue on the west side of that map. I hope you can see this map. I just wanted to share it with you to show you this is a map. There's Quamish Meadow. There's Packer Meadows here. Here's Square Butte. This is where Lewis came over to the Great Falls on his eastern route in 1806. But this map was produced for them by the Nez Perce and really helped Lewis and Clark both figure out how to get home safely. The map in the bottom is Clark's final finished, completed map of compilation of all the maps he drew in 1804, 5, and 6. And this really served as the guide, the blueprint, the travel brochure for all the trappers, the traders, the settlers that headed out to Oregon, California, and Utah. and really wasn't improved upon until about the 1850s. So there we have it. We have the Glade Creek diorama. And I think I've explained this thoroughly enough. I'll hold some for questions, but I do want to encourage you to think about a couple of things in closing. Don't forget, Travelers Rest, it's all about the horses. And somehow we need to represent horses and talk about horse transportation a little bit more than we do. If you want to follow in the footsteps and see an unspoiled, beautiful environment, go to Packer Meadows. And finally, come see us at Travelers Rest if you're not an interpretive person or a volunteer. Come on out and see us because there's plenty of good people here to help make your experience special. They'll answer your questions, and hopefully we can help keep this story alive. So Jess, I'm going to turn this back over to you. And if we have any questions, fire away.
So I actually, first of all, thank you. That was so great. I loved it. I have a personal question first. On your Horse Valley slide, you talked about how like in that one photo, travelers didn't have any trees here. So do you know where our trees came from? Because we have so many cottonwoods, ponderosas, and a few Douglas firs. So like, do you know what's the deal with that?
Well, I think I know some things. I don't know if I'm an expert. Certainly not a botanist, but I have been told that the Native Americans burned a lot of the forests down to create grassy slopes and grassy fields to feed their horses. I'm glad you picked up on that little. Clark called this Horse Valley, this area that we're in today. And I kind of wish the name would have stuck. They were using horses. They'd seen a lot of wild horses, and there was good places to graze. This was a great place for horses. So most of it, I think, was an issue of burning by intentional burning by the natives, because they certainly weren't using that for lumber. So
right, that's actually really interesting. I didn't know that, and that sounds about right. Like I believe your judgment on that.
Well, I talked to these old Forest Service volunteers that are out at the park, and that's what they tell me. So I'm okay. Going off some experts.
Okay, good. So we do have our other questions. Personal favorite of mine: how did Lewis manage to lose his horses?
Well, I don't know. I've kind of explained that these guys were really a naval expedition and were pretty good on the rivers. I'm not so sure they were great equestrians or horse people. It's funny, the practice of hobbling was used by the Shoshone and the Nez Perce, so they must have seen this. And I'm sure back in Virginia, most of these folks had hobbled their own horses. Hobbling is a practice where you just tie up the front feet so they when they graze overnight, they can't wander off too far. And it's just a strap of leather twisted around the top of their hooves. And for some reason, he didn't think that was necessary. So the horse wandered off, probably found greener grass on the other side of the hill, and all of a sudden he was lost. So I know later that Lewis and Clark, on their return trip especially, did hobble horses from time to time. Not all the time, but time to time. And so maybe that taught Lewis a lesson that, especially the horse he had, you might want to hobble it from there out.
So do you know if after his instance of losing his horse, did he lose them again, or was that the last time?
No, it wasn't the last time. He was pretty famous for losing horses, and I'd have to really research the journals to tell you when the next time was. But
that would be a funny program. All the times Lewis lost his horses.
Yeah, there was Well, coming over the Lolo Trail, they lost horses multiple times. They actually found horses. So this number that I throw out, like 45 horses, it changes almost on a daily basis when they're butchering some horses for food. They find some wild horses. They found a wild two mares and a colt down by Stevensville. So that changed the numbers even coming through the Bitterroot Valley. So this number that I use of 45 or about 45, it changes almost daily.
And when you say wild, do you think they really were wild, or were they like owned by Native Americans? Do you think?
Well, you mean the horses that they're bringing from the Shoshone and Salish? I'm going to just say that they're spirited at best. The Native American people were wonderful equestrians and probably had well-broke horses, well-trained horses. But you think that these folks are given horses for very little trade item, maybe a promise to get some guns later. So I'm not sure that Lewis and Clark were getting the cream of the crop. So these horses were, all horses have this flight instinct, and they can cause heck with you. I know I'm a horse owner, and I've always got my eye on that horse because they do some weird stuff at times. And when you're not around them a lot, they know it, and they'll take advantage.
Yeah, I've never even really been around a horse before, so I believe everything you're saying. So another question is, for the people who've never been up to Lolo Pass from Travelers Rest, how would you describe what the elevation gain and like just the rough terrain that the Corps had to traverse by foot/horse?
Well, the elevation gain between Lolo, Montana and Lolo Pass Visitor Center is almost 2,000 feet. Exactly, almost. How can you be exact at all? But it's very close. And so it goes, I think the visitor center is 5,200 feet and Lolo is 3,200 feet. It's a fairly steady incline. It's not steep like that Lost Trail Pass. You saw that picture where they're climbing up basically a cliff. It wasn't as taxing as this. It's a steady climb of 2,000 feet. And they're following an old Indian trail. The biggest complaint I heard in the journals was stepping over down timber and just kind of picking your way through that. They didn't have chainsaws to move big trees out of the way. You'd have to go over the top of them. So that seemed to be the biggest difficulty. There was other climbs like Windover Ridge took them out of the Locksaw River and back up the ridge. That is a tremendously steep and taxing climb. I've done it on foot, and I'll be honest with you, I'll never do it again. It's a hard one.
Yeah. And I guess that leads to the last question about food. So, throughout their time in Lolo or just on the expedition in general, the Corps struggled to gather food. So what would you say is the minimum amount of food that they should have been hunting and gathering for the treacherous mountains they were climbing?
Well, like I'm not a botanist, I'm not a nutritionist either, but remember, they don't have any kind of food that supplements the protein they're consuming. I mean, it's strictly a red meat diet. That's it. There's no carbohydrates. There's no fats to speak of. There's no fruit or vegetable or grains. So they've got to eat just this protein. And my guess is, a deer, an average sized deer will produce about 25, maybe 30 pounds of meat. And I think each one of these individuals needs about 3 to 4 pounds a day. remember out in the Great Falls when they're portaging around the Great Falls, there's plenty of bison and plenty of elk. They're eating 8 to 10 pounds of meat, each individual per day.
Wow.
So, I'm thinking 4 pounds is probably minimum, knowing that they can't supplement their diet with anything else. It sounds like a lot, but they're not eating anything else. So they've really got to consume a lot of meat. And frankly, all the meat is out on the plains, and the mountains don't have any game. The grass is easy to get down in the plains. It's more work up in the mountains.
It sounds like they did some bulking before they came here. When they were in Great Falls, they bulked up on their 8 to 10 pounds of meat per day, and then,
Yeah, that's an amazing number of Big Macs, I'll tell you.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, Bruce, I think that wraps up our presentation today, and I really appreciate all the helpful information you've given us.
Well, thanks, Jess, and we appreciate AmeriCorps more than you'll ever know. Thanks for making these things happen, and it's good for all of us, and it's great for the volunteers. It's also good for the visitors. So thanks for making this happen.
Yeah, of course. Yay! All right, it's on you to stop recording now. Beautiful. I really enjoyed that one. I think that was 10 out of 10. Also, we are still recording. It says recording.
Can you cut this out later?
Yeah.